Hello there. In this video, I'm going to be analyzing an argument for the common libertarian claim that taxation is theft. And I'm going to be arguing that the argument fails to justify the conclusion, namely because it relies on a highly controversial assumption which itself is not justified. So before I get into it, I just want to give a little bit of background. There was a time in which it seemed like the disputes between libertarians and so-called statists dominated the culture wars. I believe it was sometime during the Obama years. However, we don't seem to be there anymore. These days, it seems like the culture wars is dominated by issues regarding race and gender and social justice more generally. But I think it's worth getting back into some of these issues, especially because there are a lot of government programs being proposed these days, universal health care, free college, that sort of thing. And a common objection to these policies is that, well, they rely on taxation, and taxation is theft. So in order to know whether we should support or oppose these policies, we want to think clearly about these sort of claims and the arguments for them. Okay, so the central claim that we'll be considering is the claim taxation is theft. So I'm going to say a little bit to clarify this claim before we get to the argument. First, let's interpret the word theft. Now, someone might get kind of nitpicky and say, well, technically taxation isn't theft, it's extortion. So I'll just say that we're going to interpret the word theft in a broad sense, which encompasses extortion, right? So theft is sort of the illegitimate taking of something, where you need to sort of fill in the details about what makes it illegitimate. Furthermore, we're interpreting theft in the morally loaded sense as opposed to the purely legal sense, right? So there are certain laws which purport to define what counts as someone's property, and taking stuff in a way that violates these laws could be considered theft, but in the purely legal sense, relative to the current laws. Now, to see that this is not necessarily the morally loaded sense, or the sense that matters when it comes to what we should and shouldn't do, is imagine an evil dictator who takes us over and successfully rewrites all our laws, and the new laws he writes say that everything belongs to him. Well, clearly to take stuff from this person would not constitute theft in the morally loaded sense, right? Although it's theft relative to the current laws, or the laws that, that he just installed, it's not theft in the sense that matters when it comes to what we morally should and should not do. So what is this morally loaded sense? Well, presumably it has to do with not just what the current laws regarding property rights are, but what the just laws are, or what the just system of property rights is. And clearly this claim, the central claim, taxation is theft, is invoking this morally loaded sense because, the current laws allow for taxation. So clearly taxation doesn't violate the current laws. So what the claim is getting at is that taxation is in violation of the just system of property rights. Okay, I also want to clarify the scope of the claim, right? So the claim is not merely asserting that some taxation is theft, because this claim would be sort of too weak, too uncontroversial to be interesting. Pretty much everyone would accept that some form of taxation is theft, right? Again, if an evil dictator takes us over and demands a portion of our income to enrich himself and his friends, pretty much everyone would regard that as theft. So that's too weak a claim. It's trivial. It's not interesting. What we're interested in is the far stronger claim, the more controversial claim that all taxation is theft. Taxation, by its very nature, is theft. Even if the tax revenue goes towards what it's, supposed to, even if the proper democratic process is followed, even so-called ideal taxation is theft. Now, you might also consider a restricted version of the claim that says all taxation of a certain sort is theft. For instance, I can imagine there being lots of people who think, okay, maybe it's not the case that all taxation is theft, but all redistributive taxation is theft. So you might consider a claim like that. I think I will analyze that sort of claim and the arguments for it in a future video. But in this video, we're interpreting the central claim in the strongest way. It's asserting that all taxation is theft. So remember that I'm going to be considering an argument for the central claim, and I'm going to argue that the argument fails. Now, that doesn't mean that the central claim is false, although I do believe it's false. What it means is that you shouldn't believe that taxation is theft on the basis of this argument or similar ones. It fails to justify the conclusion. Okay, so let's get into the first version of the argument. We're going to see a couple versions. We're going to have to revise it a couple times to make it better. So here is the first version, argument A. Premise 1, taxation involves people using threats or force to obtain something. Premise 2, anything that involves people using threats or force to obtain something is theft, so taxation is theft. Right, so here we have a valid argument. The premises entail the conclusion. The only question is, should we accept these premises? Premise 1 is pretty much uncontroversial. We all know what happens if you refuse to pay your taxes. There are certainly threats or force involved, right? But this second premise is too strong. It's subject to some pretty compelling counterexamples. So let's look at a couple of these. If a worker does the agreed upon job and then the person refuses to pay them, well, if they use threats or force to obtain what they're owed, that's not theft, at least intuitively. If you get mugged and you're feeling brave, so you use threats or force to get your wallet back, that's not theft, right? If your child gets kidnapped and you use threats or force to get reunited with your child, that's not theft. And this one's a little bit more controversial, but if you refuse to pay your rent and the landlady comes to collect the rent, she can use threats or force to obtain it, and that's not theft, right? There's some people who will reject this last counterexample because they think charging rent is illegitimate. That's fine. I'm sure you're not going to reject the rest of these as counterexamples. So in each one of these cases, the person is using threats or force to obtain something, but it doesn't constitute theft. So clearly we have to revise the argument to fix this problem. So here's the second version of the argument, argument B. Premise 1, taxation involves people using threats or force to obtain something that they have no right to obtain. Anything that involves people using threats or force to obtain something that they have no right to obtain is theft, so taxation is theft. So I've underlined the added components here, right? So B2 now avoids those counterexamples, right? So here we have the counterexamples. In each one of these cases, the person using threats or force to obtain something has a right to obtain it. Again, if you reject the rent one, that's fine. You can leave that one out. But in at least the other cases, the person has a right to obtain it, and so using threats and force to do so is not theft. However, notice that in adding this revision to both premises, the first premise has now become controversial, right? Before, it just asserted that there's threats and force or force involved, which is obviously true. But now there's a moral component added to this premise, right? It's saying that the people using threats or force to obtain something through taxation have no right to obtain it. Now you might think that this premise is true, but you must admit that now it's controversial, or a lot more controversial than it was before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this argument one more time, and I'm going to isolate the controversial component, just so we can think about it on its own, get real clear on what it takes for this argument to succeed. So here we have the third and final version of this argument, argument C. Premise 1, Taxation involves people using threats or force to obtain something. Premise 2, the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it. Premise 3, anything that involves people using threats or force to obtain something that they have no right to obtain is theft. So taxation is theft, right? So the first premise is once again uncontroversial. It's just expressing the fact that there's threats or force involved, which is obvious. The third premise seems good enough, right? We've avoided those counterexamples. C2 is the controversial premise, right? The recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it. Who are the recipients of taxation? Well, presumably this includes the government workers whose salaries are paid through taxation, right? And also anyone who would use certain government programs or receive government benefits. They're also recipients of taxation, or the benefits of taxation. So the C2 here is the controversial assumption in this argument. And this is the assumption that's going to need to be justified for this argument to succeed in justifying the conclusion. Okay, now that this argument relies on this assumption might strike you as obvious, but I think it's actually a highly significant point. Okay, so the point is this. Whenever you see a person, let's say person A, pull out a gun and point it towards person B and threaten them and make them hand over something that person B is in possession of, right? What you've witnessed there is not enough to determine whether theft has occurred, right? In order to determine whether theft has occurred, you need to know who has a right to what in the envisioned scenario, right? If person B had a right to whatever they were in possession of, then person A using threats of force to obtain it is theft. But if actually person A had a right to what person B was in possession of, then person A using threats or force to obtain it is not theft. So exactly what actions constitute theft depends on claims about property rights. And I think this is a very, very important point. I think you cannot really get clear on this conclusion that taxation is theft, on whether you should accept it, until you think more about property rights. And so if you're a proponent of this argument, right, if you're someone who does believe that taxation is theft on the basis of an argument like this, C2 is the assumption you're going to have to work to justify. And if you're an opponent of this argument, right, if you want to reject the conclusion, I think C2 is the premise you should be attacking. Okay, so how might we justify this second premise, the controversial assumption? Well, before I get into that, I just want to clarify something. Some of you might be tempted to say something like this. Look, if you're claiming that the recipients of taxation have a right to it, then the burden is on you to defend that. And to this I respond, that's true. If someone makes a claim that the recipients of taxation have a right to it, then they need to defend that claim. It's a controversial claim. It requires some sort of an argument in defense of it. However, if you're asserting the negation of that claim, if you're asserting C2, the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it, you're also making a claim. And so you also have a burden to defend it. Anytime you make a claim, whether that claim is a positive claim, something is the case, or a negative claim, something is not the case, you have a burden to defend it, right? If you claim that God exists, you have a burden to defend it. If you claim that God does not exist, you have a burden to defend it. So, because we're considering an argument for the central claim that taxation is theft, because that argument relies on this controversial assumption, in order to justify that conclusion that taxation is theft, we need to justify this controversial assumption. Now, this assumption is certainly controversial in the context of this sort of argument, since there are people who think government is legitimate, and so government workers, are owed a salary, and they have a right to obtain it. There are people who think certain government programs are legitimate, and so people have a right to make use of them or access them. And so because this assumption is controversial, if you're going to try to persuade people that taxation is theft, and this is a premise in your argument, you're going to have to defend this premise. So how might we defend this premise? Well, here's the basic structure of an argument for this controversial assumption, and then we'll fill in the details. The argument for C2 should look something like this. Premise 1, the recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it only if blah. Premise 2, it's not the case that blah. Conclusion, so the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it. Right? So premise 1 is expressing a necessary condition on acquiring a right to something. And then premise 2 is saying that necessary condition does not obtain, and the conclusion saying, therefore, the recipients of taxation do not have a right to obtain it. Now, there are a couple other ways you might structure this argument, but I think this way makes the most sense. So, let's see if we can fill in the blank and construct the argument for this controversial assumption. So here is where I think the argument will start. Okay, I think we're going to have to revise this. I think this one doesn't work, but this is where I think many people would. This is the sort of argument that I think people would have in mind to justify this sort of claim. All right, argument D. Premise 1, the recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it only if people consented, whether explicitly or implicitly, to pay taxes. Premise 2, people did not consent, explicitly or implicitly, to pay taxes, so the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it. So we're going to discuss this second premise a little bit later, but I first want to look at this first premise. It's asserting a necessary condition on the recipients of taxation having a right to obtain it, saying, look, they only have a right to obtain it if this obtains, and this does not obtain, therefore they don't have a right to it. But should we accept this first premise? Should we accept D1? Have we overlooked any conceivable ways that someone might gain the right to something? Right? If we're trying to convince people or justify the claim that the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it, we're going to want to give them very compelling premises that they have a very difficult time rejecting, right? Premises that lead to this conclusion. But it seems like the first premise is not that difficult to reject, right? All you have to say is, look, you're saying there's only one way that someone can gain the right to something, namely if other people with the right to it consent to give it to them. But you might think, look, there are plenty of other conceivable ways that someone can gain the right to something. And so the argument's not going to be that compelling if we sort of overlook these things, if we ignore these conceivable ways of gaining the right to something. So let's go back to thinking about the structure of this argument, right? Before, we just had a single way that you can come to acquire rights to something, but if there are multiple conceivable ways to gain the right to something, our argument should account for that, and it should instead look something like this. The recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it only if A or B or C, and so on and so forth, where each one of these elements is one of the conceivable ways that someone might argue the recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it, right? And then the rest of the premises in this argument will deny each one. It'll say, it's not the case that A, it's not the case that B, it's not the case that C, so on and so forth, until we get to the conclusion, so the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it. So again, this argument for the controversial assumption should really take this form rather than the previous one, because we don't want to overlook any conceivable ways that someone could argue the recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it. We want to account for all of them and then argue against each one. So let's now fill in the details here and see what the argument looks like. So this argument's pretty big, a lot of details involved. I'm going to go through it pretty slowly. First, premise 1, the recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it only if people, and then I've come up with 5 conceivable ways someone could argue that they have the right to obtain it, right? Only if people consented explicitly or implicitly to pay taxes, owe taxes as compensation for unrequested benefits received, owe taxes as restitution for harms inflicted, owe taxes as satisfaction for the proviso on property acquisition, or have enforceable positive obligations of mutual aid. Okay, just wanted to get those out on the table. I'll discuss each one individually. So first, we've already discussed this first one, right? Most people will agree that if someone has a right to something, then if they consent to transfer it to someone else, the new person has thereby acquired a right to it. That one's pretty trivial. Most people accept that. Here are some others, though. People might owe taxes as compensation for unrequested benefits received. Right? If you get benefited by something, you might owe compensation for that, even if you didn't request that benefit. Now, I think there are going to be plenty of people who deny this, who say, no, it doesn't matter if you were benefited. The only thing that matters is whether you agreed to it voluntarily. That's a position you could take. However, I just want to give a case that might motivate this way of coming to acquire a right to something. You might think that a child, when they're grown up, has an obligation to care for their elderly parents if their parents cared for them when they were a child and, raised them well, etc. And notice that the child, right, didn't consent to this arrangement. They didn't voluntarily agree to be brought into existence and to be raised by parents who they would then care for as elderly people. They never agreed to this contract ahead of time. And yet you might think still the child, when they're grown up, does owe their parents some care, provided that their parents cared for them as a child. So in that case, you have the child, when they grow up, owing compensation to their parents in the form of care, right, for getting benefited as a child, even if it was unrequested. Again, you might reject this, but this is at least a conceivable way someone can acquire the right to something, right? You might think the elderly parents acquire the right to be cared for by their children because of the care they provided their children. Here's another way. People might owe taxes as restitution for harms inflicted, right? Pretty much everyone would agree that if you violate someone's rights or you harm someone, you owe them compensation for that. Furthermore, even if you're not the one that did the rights violation or harmed someone, let's say that your mother was a bank robbing, armed robbing serial killer, and she murdered someone, stole all their property, and then she left it to you. You inherited it. You might think that you, even though you didn't commit the rights violation or the harm, you might think that because you received some illegitimately acquired goods, you owe restitution to the relatives of the victim, right? So taxes could be seen as restitution for harms inflicted. Harms inflicted either by the people paying taxes themselves, right? For instance, companies that pollute or in other ways inflict costs on other people, they might owe taxes as restitution for that. Similarly, if a good portion of the current distribution of property, if it could be argued that it's a result of rights violations in the historical chain, perhaps some people owe taxes as restitution for that. Again, even if they weren't the ones who committed the rights violation, if they received the benefits from the rights violation, you might think they owe compensation to either the victims or the relatives of the victims who would have inherited the money, right? Those victims or the relatives of the victims might have a right to it. Again, plenty of room for debate, but this is at least a conceivable way someone could argue that the recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it, certain kinds of taxation. The fourth one, people might owe taxes as satisfaction of the proviso for property acquisition. So I'm going to try to go through this one as briefly as possible. What is property, right? Well, property is, in some sense, a system that allows some people to exclude other people from using certain resources or interacting with a certain part of the natural world, certain part of the universe, right? If I own, this apartment or this laptop, then I'm essentially excluding everyone else in the world from walking in here, from touching these physical objects. And you might think, well, I'm limiting people's freedom by doing this. What justifies this? Why do I have the right to restrict people's freedom in this way? And any theory of property rights is going to have to say something about this. So a famous theory, John Locke's theory of property rights, included something like this: the idea that, look, if you labor on using certain resources, mix your labor with them, you acquire the right over it. That's sort of part of the story. But another component of the theory is that there's a certain constraint on property acquisition. You can't just acquire property in an unlimited, unrestricted way. You have to make sure that a certain proviso is satisfied. Now, the Lockean version of it was something like you have to leave enough and as good for others, right? There might be different versions of this. I think the actual details of the proviso, the appropriate proviso, is controversial, but pretty much any plausible theory of property rights will include some such proviso that must be satisfied in order for property claims to be justified. And so you might think, look, certain forms of taxation is just a way of having people satisfy this proviso. You need to compensate people for restricting their freedom in a certain way, for restricting their freedom to interact with a certain part of the universe, to walk in certain places, etc. Now, in my mind, it seems most plausible that a highly progressive tax would accomplish this the best, since the more money you have, the more resources you control, the more resources you're excluding others from using. So the more you have to pay to satisfy this proviso. So again, this is just another conceivable way someone might argue that the recipients of certain forms of taxation have a right to obtain it. People have a right to be, left a certain amount of resources so that they can, do what you did, essentially gain ownership over resources, improve them, etc. Just a pair of cases to motivate this thought, right? Suppose you're on a desert island with plenty of resources, plenty of trees, plenty of coconuts. Let's say you cut down a tree and collect some coconuts. You make yourself a little hut and you eat the coconuts. You might think, in doing this, you've succeeded in establishing a just claim of property ownership over your hut and over the coconuts, right? Someone couldn't just come along and, take all your stuff and use your stuff without your consent. However, if you instead imagine a case of there's a single oasis in a desert for miles, right? You might think that someone who tries to claim ownership of the whole oasis fails to do so, right? Even if they labor on it in a certain way, even if they improve it, they make a little walkway, they clean it up a bit, you might think, look, they still haven't established a claim of ownership over the whole oasis because they haven't satisfied the proviso. They haven't left the appropriate amount of access to the commons for other people, right? If, again, it's the only oasis for miles, the only source of water for miles, you might think, look, they can't gain ownership over the whole thing, and that's because the proviso would not be satisfied in such a case. So those cases should just help to motivate the idea that there is some such proviso on property acquisition, and if you are attempting to acquire just ownership over some part of the natural world, you owe it to others to compensate them for limiting and restricting their freedom in a certain way, for no longer having access to resources. Finally, and you libertarians out there, if you didn't like these previous ones, you're definitely not going to like this one, but again, we want to get it all out on the table, right? So people might have enforceable positive obligations of mutual aid, by which I mean people might have an obligation to help others, and people might have a right to be helped in certain circumstances. So just an idea to motivate this, right? Suppose that some child falls off of this big cruise ship into dangerous waters. Suppose it's too dangerous for other people to jump in. Let's also suppose there's a very rich person on board holding a life vest. Let's also suppose that they own this cruise ship, and this cruise ship is also filled to the brim of life vests. And for good measure, let's also say they own 15 mansions, each of which is also full to the brim of life vests. So they have tons and tons of life vests. They're not going to miss this one life vest. You might think, look, this rich person has an obligation to throw the life vest in to help the child, to save the child's life. And similarly, the child has a right to be aided in this way, a right to be thrown this life vest, right? So I know that there are going to be a lot of people out there who deny this, right? Who think, no, there are no positive rights of this sort, no obligations like this. You might say, look, the rich guy would be a huge asshole if he didn't help the child. It'd be much morally better of him to help, but you might think he doesn't have an obligation to do so, and he doesn't violate anybody's rights in not doing so. That's a position you could take, right? But you could also conceivably take the opposite position. You might think, yes, this rich person does have an obligation to help. And you might say, look, the reason he does is because the benefit would be very great and the cost to this person would be extremely small. Remember, they've got mansions and mansions full of life vests. And you might think, look, the positive obligations you have to helping others is a function of the benefit you can provide and the cost to you, right? So when the cost is super small, you do have an obligation to help, and people have a right to be helped. So this is, again, another conceivable way that someone might argue people acquire the right to obtain tax revenue or government programs funded through taxation. Just to clarify, what do I mean by enforceable? Well, you might think that not only does the rich person have this obligation and does the drowning child have the right to be helped, but you might think that other people are morally permitted to enforce this, right? You might think if you have a gun and you're on the side of the cruise ship, you are morally permitted to take out your gun and force the rich person to throw the life vest in if the rich person refuses. So that's what I mean by an enforceable positive obligation of mutual aid. Okay, so this is the first premise. It's saying, look, the recipients of taxation have a right to obtain it only if people either do this or this or this or this or this, right? And so the rest of this argument is going to have to deny that each one is the case. Okay, so let's get the rest of the argument up on the table. Premise 2. People did not consent, explicitly or implicitly, to pay taxes. People don't owe taxes as compensation for unrequested benefits received. People don't owe taxes as restitution for harms inflicted. People don't owe taxes as satisfaction of the proviso for property acquisition. And people don't have enforceable positive obligations of mutual aid. Therefore, the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it. So this is the full argument. I think this is the sort of argument you're going to need in order to justify the controversial assumption down here. And remember that the controversial assumption must be justified in order for our original argument to justify the claim, the central claim, that taxation is theft. So why do I think the argument for the central claim fails? Well, I think it fails to justify the conclusion because I think the controversial assumption is unjustified. And I think that because I think this argument fails to justify it. Why is that? Well, remember that for this argument, or any argument, to succeed in justifying the conclusion, right, it must be valid, first of all, right? The premises must entail the conclusion. This is valid. But also each premise must be justified. Every single premise. And I simply think that it's not the case that every premise here is justified. In fact, I think every premise here is subject to a great deal of doubt. Again, maybe some of them can be justified. I think there's plenty of room for disagreement on some of these things. But I think it's very unlikely that anyone's going to be able to justify every single premise here. So again, the second premise is saying people did not consent explicitly or implicitly to pay taxes. You might think that you might challenge this premise by saying, look, you consent to it simply by engaging in commerce in a certain country with taxation or in making use of certain government programs. In the same way that you consent to pay your bill, your restaurant bill at the end of a meal, simply by remaining in the restaurant and eating food there. Again, I think there's room to debate here, but that's at least the challenge that must be overcome to justify the second premise. The third premise, again, you can think that no, nobody owes anything as compensation for unrequested benefits received. You only owe something if you agreed to them, if you requested the benefits, if you consented to the arrangement. But I think that's a very difficult claim to justify, right? It seems just as plausible. In fact, it seems more plausible to me that if you do benefit from a certain system, then you owe some compensation. You owe it to the other people involved to contribute to that system so that the system can continue to benefit people. This fourth premise, people don't owe taxes as restitution for harms inflicted. Again, I think a good case could be made that this is false. First of all, a lot of pollution and other costs are inflicted on other people, and these are harms for which there needs to be restitution, and collecting tax revenue, certain forms of taxes, could be a very efficient way to satisfy this, right? Similarly, like I said, there might have been injustices that we can demonstrate have occurred in the historical chain that would justify some forms of taxation as restitution. I think this fifth premise is particularly implausible, right? I think it's any plausible theory of property rights will include some such proviso on property acquisition in order to justify excluding people from using some part of the universe. And so certain forms of taxation, again, I think highly progressive taxation would accomplish this the best. Certain forms of taxation can be seen as just you satisfying the proviso on property acquisition, right? You acquiring a lot of resources is only justified to the extent that you make sure other people have enough resources to do something similar. Finally, again, there are people who don't believe in positive obligation, positive rights. I think, there's definitely room to debate here, but at the very least, you need a compelling argument to justify that claim. I myself find it more plausible that we do have such obligations and people do have corresponding rights. And so I think this premise is also unjustified. So because each one of these premises is subject to a great deal of doubt, and you need every premise to be justified in order to justify this conclusion, I think this argument fails to justify the controversial assumption that the recipients of taxation have no right to obtain it. And since the controversial assumption is not justified, the original argument for taxation is theft fails to justify that claim. But if you disagree, right, if you think that this argument can be made to work, you can justify each premise, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.